So welcome to episode 5 of the Gratitude for Time podcast. My guest today is Dr. Carlos Montemayor. Dr. Montemayor got a law degree from Mexico with a focus on human rights. He has a PhD in philosophy with a focus on cognition and time. And he's been a professor of philosophy at San Francisco State for 13 to 14 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, I arrived in 2009, so it's
like 11, okay, yeah, like 11, a long 12. Time. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm really excited for our conversation. Oh, I actually forgot to mention that you're also an author, and that your book is called Minding Time. I know there's a little bit after that as well, but I just wanted to kind of make it easy on people. And then you're also a co-author of 2 other books, I believe. Can you just briefly describe those?
Sure. And thanks so much for inviting me. I always enjoy talking to you about time and temporalities and scales.
Yeah.
The other 2 books are one of them is on consciousness and attention, sort of the relationship between attention and consciousness. It focuses a lot on empirical issues that psychologists have discovered about this, especially about attention and its relation to forms of awareness. But it also covers most of the main philosophical views that pertain to the psychology of consciousness and attention. And then the other book is on attention as well, but it's an analysis of attention that examines the importance of attention for knowledge production, but also knowledge acquisition, and just justification of several things, justification of your beliefs, but also your justification of what you see when you perceive the world. So those are the other 2.
Okay. So that's all going to be fun to talk about as we kind of get into this. But before we jump in, can you just give a brief description of your background? I know you briefly just mentioned you were from Mexico City. Can you just kind of give us a little your timeline and then let us know who you are?
Absolutely. I grew up in Mexico City. I studied law at the National University of Mexico, UNAM. It is a really interesting place to study because it is the major public university. It is kind of the result of the Mexican Revolution, so it has this very public outreach towards the different populations of Mexico. And my focus while I was there was not only studying, but working on human rights with different groups. I was very fortunate that when I was studying, the Zapatista uprising happened, the indigenous uprising of the people from Chiapas and the Comandante Marcos. So I became very, very interested in the rights of indigenous people, but also that was an interest that I had before, but also in the situation with human rights in Mexico and in general. And we will talk more about this as we go on with the interview. But one very interesting thing about human rights is that they're not just national commitments of governments. They're not just sort of national obligations governments have toward their citizens. There are international obligations. They are perhaps the most interesting and foundational international obligations. So it was very interesting for me to see how some treaties were interpreted in Mexico, how the Constitution of Mexico incorporated principles from international tribunals and international jurisprudence, and also just what's the nature of human rights. They're not really obligations. They're kind of principles. They're foundational. They're very important for constitutions to have a moral foundation. So I worked on a lot on that, even a little bit with the situation of some prisoners, and just in general the prison system, how it works, and how it, like in most parts of the world, it's unfairly biased towards the poor. that was basically my background. I was always interested in philosophy. Uh, when I started working on human rights, I realized that the notion of dignity, the notion of having rights in a democratic society, but also structuring a society according to some principles of knowledge and some principles of
Mm-hmm.
cultural uh, uh, notions or principles, all depended on philosophical answers to certain problems. So why is it that humans have dignity? What is human dignity? Is it associated with the fact that we're aware, that we're conscious? That's one of the answers. Another
Mm-hmm.
answer is that we can experience certain emotions that are morally salient. Another one is that we're rational, that we have rational capacities. So it became very clear to me that if I wanted to understand better uh, the nature of dignity and rights, I needed to study more the mind. And then I eventually, by studying the mind, I became very interested in perception
Mm-hmm.
and the perception of time. That's how I ended up
Yeah.
working on time.
Yep. And that's kind of how we got connected.
That's right.
Was through time. So let me kind of jump in here and ask this first question. So what do human rights mean given the realities of quantum mechanics and relativity?
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a. I mean, the initial take, for example, a scientist would uh, go for is that these are orthogonal questions. That the question of human rights should be independent
Mm-hmm.
from whatever we know about relativity and quantum mechanics. That would be the technical answer.
Is that
Uh,
possible though?
what I would say is I don't like the technical answer, as you know. I
Yeah.
mean, as I'm pretty sure you also
Mm-hmm.
do. So what I think is that putting it in terms of time helps actually.
Yeah.
The notion of dignity is an atemporal notion. It's if there is such a thing as human dignity,
Mm-hmm.
it's not going to be contingent on some short-term planning or some contingent facts that only
Yep.
holds locally. It's going to be
Yep.
some deeper truth.
Mm-hmm.
Physics studies that kind of deeper truth, and
Yep.
the notion of time, cosmological time, and that is very in general relativity is integrated with cosmological space and the
Mm-hmm.
productivity of space and time, the fabric of space and time,
Yeah.
with the principles of quantum mechanics, which are principles about how measurements are a very vital part of how outcomes in
Yep.
respect to uh,
Yeah.
different
What you
aspects of
measure.
reality are
Yeah.
integrated. That
What you measure and how you measure is going to influence the reality that you experience.
so
For sure.
those, I mean, that way of having a general temporal perspective that is assumed in physics is definitely very important
Mm-hmm.
to understand issues in morality like human rights and human
Mm-hmm.
dignity. Uh, Now, there is nothing in physics really that would force you to accept this. There is nothing. I mean, some physicists even say, as you know very well
Yeah.
because you've studied this a lot, that there's nothing in physics that forces you to accept the asymmetry of time, the not the asymmetry, but the passage of time. But the
Yep.
passage of
Yep.
time is this more sort of
So,
conscious
yeah, it's a
phenomenon.
psychological perception more so than um, it is something that exists outside in the universe, even though the case can be probably made one way or another.
Yeah, and,
Um,
and and that's one way of seeing that there is a relation between a notion of consciousness and having dignity because you're a conscious being and the notion of time that
mhm.
physicists try to explain.
Do
Because
you, sorry, do you, what do you think that the passage of time is a real thing, or do you think that it is a psychological perception that
um,
technically is like a scalable psychological perception for every living thing.
I definitely think that the passage of time is a reality. It's a very real phenomenon for all biological systems.
Yep.
Biological systems are defined in terms of a lifespan, and the lifespan of living creatures determines the kind of capacities they need to survive. And that is definitely this notion of having needs that are temporally bound is essential for human rights. You know, our need to educate ourselves, to have long-term goals, to have property, to have privacy. They're all framed within the lifespan of a human existence. So there's definitely that reality is crucial to define biological systems, but also to define cultural aspects of temporal scales. In physics, it's a bit different, because in physics, you kind of need the notion of passage of time, for example, to understand certain cosmological phenomena.
There's no evolution without the passage of time.
Correct. And so you need something like a past assumption, like a past hypothesis, where there was an initiation of a certain process that then we are at a certain point in time after the process, and that there's been a passage, sort of like that time has carried its passage and has made it so that some things happen rather than others. And that it's ticking at a certain rate, right? So it's accelerating or decelerating or going really fast. So there you kind of definitely need this notion of passage. But for example, for the equations of, for most equations, other than the
its time is it's reversible.
Exactly. Right. And so I think that there's still, and I think we talked about this before, I think we still don't understand time very well. I think we need a deeper understanding. Physics is a good
starting place.
Psychology is a good starting place. You know, the phenomenology of time, how we experience time, is a good starting place. But we still lack a completely thorough understanding of the complexity of time. We have insights into how to understand aspects of time, but we don't really we don't really have a comprehensive and accurate account.
And that probably is true of the universe, the mind, the brain,
and their connection.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and that might be the most important thing. That's one of the questions but it's not that the mind is just important on its own and the brain is important on its own and time is important on its own, but their relationship together and how they influence each other and evolve together, I think, is what makes each of those things so incredibly important. I mean, even now with the gut and how much the gut influences our like biological functioning and state of mind and all of that. So I think really it comes down to that relationship between things. And so maybe I have a question here. Okay, so I guess we can just hop into that question, which is, what is the relationship between our mind and time?
Yeah, that's a great question too. Here, there's a very interesting kind of more science. I mean, the science is kind of interesting, but I will try to give a more.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess from the context of, say, you're just the average individual going about your life, you know, what is that relationship between your mind and time going to either consciously or unconsciously have on you, you know?
Yeah, that's great. So one thing that is going to have an impact on you are your biological cycles. Those are kind of genetically programmed. They are very interesting. They are visceral. You were talking about the gut. They're connected to the brainstem, and the older parts of the brain are very important. The circadian clock in animals, our circadian clock is very close to the brainstem. So these are cycles that we follow when we fall asleep, when we digest, and they very much determine the kinds of lives we have.
Mhm.
So, for example, we spend a lot of our time sleeping. That's definitely having an impact on how we live our lives. And that's determined by these cycles. Right?
Mhm.
So that's an aspect of time that has an important effect on not only on our minds, but our cultures. Our calendars are cyclical. Our calendars are day-to-day calendars. The day cycle is determined by our circadian clock. The circadian clock, in turn, is determined by the rotation of the Earth on its own axis. So these are natural cycles that have a big impact on our lives. Then there's going to be the kind of, time is money sort of timing, or more rapid, immediate interval clocks are going to have a big impact on what we do during the day, and how what we do during the day, which is on a much smaller scale than this repetition of the cycle of the day across our lives, in terms of years and decades. These shorter timed events have an impact on our long-term planning and our short-term planning, and also in how we experience time. So I think the experience of time, we have a pure experience of time, sort of like how we feel. Well, for example, when we're breathing or trying to meditate or looking at a beautiful painting, we feel like time is just expanding. But I think our contemporary experience of time is one of the most narrow-sighted probably in history, because we have so many obligations and we have to check email so many times that we're stressed by time. We're not really living time as it should or it could be experienced. And these other cycles, these other natural cycles, have taken a sort of like a very secondary role.
Yeah, backseat.
A backseat. We're now sort of dominated by the clicking time of the demands of social media, email, our phones, which are constantly updating.
Even the algorithms, which operate on like femtoseconds, which are like millionths of a second or something. Those influence all of the stock market pretty much. The entirety of the stock market is like connected and interacting based on these algorithms, which really operate in timescales that we can never operate in.
That's correct. And they're also the algorithms that frame what is called now the attention economy, right? So how we exploit our attention capacities to produce money for social media corporations. That's also a kind of timing that is addictive, right? Is sort of the timing of producing more and more clicks, more and more attention. And so I think one big problem we have now for any kind of planning is that our attention is addicted to these very, very short, rewarding cycles that are not only artificial, they're produced by companies and produced by technology.
For profit,
For profit, but they're also quite they're erosive of the other temporalities that we need to inhabit.
So it
including the biological cycles.
Okay, so I just want to piggyback off of that really. So you're kind of saying like the eroding attention span we have because we're looking through social media, we're getting notifications, we're wondering about those things even when they're not hitting us. That rapid fire, I guess, against your attention really hurts your longer time scales, which are like your circadian clock. It makes it harder to value sleep. It makes it harder to value doing something in the short term that helps you in the long term. Maybe it's reading a book, maybe it's listening to a podcast or something. It makes it harder to value and do those things because you're not looking on long enough time scales. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, and just to introduce a notion of value here,
Mm-hmm.
being so constrained by the demands of this solicitation, this constant solicitation of our attention.
Mm-hmm.
We can't really value time itself. We're just kind of trapped in the temporalities of these algorithmic forms of
Mm-hmm.
solicitation, and we just can't enjoy just like sitting and I mean, we watch a movie, but even movies are time, and we
Yeah, and
know that
everyone's
after
on
the
their phone
movie
anyway.
we need to do something else. And so
Mm-hmm.
it is going to be interesting to see just how much this is harming our many of our needs. And so, for example, one of the examples that is very related to human rights is this kind of uh, dependence on the internet and our computers that dominate how we live our lives, especially now during the pandemic. But in general,
Mm-hmm.
before that was the case, prevent us from being more empathic. This is a very solipsistic thing we do, that we spend a lot of time in front of computers thinking of our short-term plans. And we just forget about the rest of our
Yeah.
fellow human beings
Mm-hmm.
and their needs and their own temporalities, and how by ultra focusing on technological forms of temporality, we're ignoring huge parts of the world that are suffering from lack of
Yeah.
technology, but also from lack of help.
Mm-hmm.
So I think even if you think in terms of human rights, this is a problem. But even just within psychology, we are harming some capacities we need to
Yeah.
live a fruitful life with dignity and with a certain degree of well-being.
So it was, I think earlier this week, I sat in on a webinar for like, I think it was called the Los Angeles World's Affair Convention or something. But essentially, they brought on 5 people that were journalists or experts on certain protests occurring throughout the world. So they had a person from Belarus, from Russia, from Thailand. Um, and a lot of what they talked about in terms of human rights and things like that were um, these dictators, right? But what I really learned, what it wasn't just about the dictator or the person in charge, but it was the system that they'd created
Mm-hmm.
that was really the worst thing.
Yeah.
And it was the thing that they're trying to gain their human rights back from was, of course, this dictator person. But to me, the thing that's invisible and less seen, but far more powerful, is that system that's created. So I guess how can people, maybe just we'll stick with Americans here, how can Americans gain human rights from systems that systemically take those rights away or encourage us to not engage in those rights?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. First of all, I really like what you said. I really agree that the
Mm-hmm.
problem is not a specific person called a dictator. The problem is the perpetuation of a system that monitors the population for paternalistic purposes. But it's not even the paternalism is not that relevant. What is relevant is that human suffering is the rule rather than exception.
Yeah.
And in a system like the US, since you asked particularly about the US,
Yeah.
what you have is overlapping systems that are kind of biased towards oppression. For example, the market system is biased towards the perpetuation of certain class that has, and there's nothing unique about the class other than they have power. And then you have systems that we implement for our daily lives, like the internet or social media, and you have, of course, the legal system. The legal system has notions that were developed 2,000 years ago, maybe even more. They're very old notions, like property, and how you need to protect your property, and you need to have your family and
Mm-hmm.
so on. And so we have some systems that are much older, that are also, so the protection of property that is unlimited, right? So the fact that some people can be, billionaires, well, most people are living check to check.
Mm-hmm.
That's very new, but the notion of property is the same.
Mm.
And then the fact that people lack privacy, not because there's a spy that comes to their apartment and inspects them day by day, but because they go to social media and click on things.
Mm-hmm.
That's also new. But the notion of privacy, of course, is old. So we have a combination of systems, some of which are newer, like the financial market, that is sort of completely industrialized and limited, sort of capitalistic. It allows
Mm-hmm.
for limitless accumulation of wealth at the cost of the population.
Yep.
That's kind of, I mean, it's newer than legal systems, but legal systems are used to implement this other system.
Mm-hmm.
And the threat, for example, to privacy or to have meaningful communication is coming from systems that are extremely new, that are overwhelming our capacities to digest information, and are not really produced either by legal systems or the financial market, but they are protected by both. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I think is the problem is, I mean, most Americans are vulnerable to the overlap of these systems, and to explain this in simple terms is very difficult. So what happens is people point fingers at other people.
Yep.
And that's a mistake, because, as you were very rightly saying, it's not that a single person is the problem, or a group of people is the problem, or your neighbor is the problem. The problem is that there are these gigantic structures that frame knowledge production, industrial production. They control how populations behave.
Yep.
And can predict population behavior.
Yep.
And those are ingrained in
Yep.
our institutions. Those are ingrained in legal protections, financial systems, and the technologies we use to communicate. So it is a really big challenge for human rights, to guarantee human rights in this context. So just to one thing before I stop, and I don't want to talk, because your questions are really excellent.
No.
I think to really protect human rights, a reevaluation of how these systems are overlapping is very needed.
Mm-hmm.
And human rights need to have at least a branch of human rights protection that focuses on information technologies.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense, especially in a world where we're exceedingly information and data, and the attention is arguably, and time obviously, are the most valuable commodities being traded around and given and monetized.
Yeah.
So kind of like focusing in on systems here. I remember reading your book, Minding Time, and a lot of that is talking about like phases and cycles and phase transitions and things like that between systems or an organism or something like that. So kind of to bring it here is, so how do you see the change of pace, or the rate of change, influencing how these systems interact? So what I mean by that is our police, prison system, and are pretty slow changing. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to like create some changes there.
Mm-hmm.
But you go to Silicon Valley, you go to other places, New York, where a lot of like innovation and startups are occurring. The rate of change for our society, I think, is pretty high as well.
Mm-hmm.
So how does these different rates of change influence our environment and how these systems are going to work?
no, that's really important. So I think we associate uh, this thing that I was calling very stressful time, that the fact that time is stressful, that that is ticking very fast, that you need to produce very fast, that you need to overcompete your enemies very fast, very quickly, and that you need to produce enormous amounts to be sort of in time at the right time.
Competent.
Competent.
I guess what the nice image is that I've heard is it's like being on a treadmill, but also you have to hop to the next treadmill that's going faster and faster, and it's just a constant going to a faster treadmill. So you're kind of going nowhere, but you're going faster and faster.
That's
and
right.
It's almost like a hell of some sort.
Yeah, it is a kind of hell. It is a self-destructive kind of thing. But the amazing thing is that people associate that kind of jumping from treadmill to treadmill with a sort of autonomy and independence. Right? So they feel this is my right. I have the right to be a very productive, entrepreneur, and to dictate my own sort of my own in my own terms how competitive I'm going to be. So they associate that with it's a very short-term scale, and it's as you said, it's a kind of self-fulfilling vast prophecy, because you're getting more and more stressed, you have less quality of life, but at the same time you are there's no end to what you're doing, right? You're just producing at a faster pace. And what people don't realize, I mean, what this is, people realize, but they don't understand that there's a temporal aspect to this. Is that time scale gives you a kind of autonomy that depends fundamentally on a much larger scale of time. One way to see this is your biological cycles, right? So those are determined by much more reliable and repetitive time frames. These phases where you're phase locking with other circadian clocks. We wake up at roughly the same times in the same time zone. So that's really interesting.
The relationship with the Earth and Sun there, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and that's really fascinating that we are still locked with these celestial events. But we think of these super fast-paced, selfish time scale as our independence from those older cycles. But without those cycles, we wouldn't be alive. And then if you think about much longer cycles, like the cycle, the cyclical reproductive cycles of a whole ecosystem, like a forest. Without those, if there's a tipping point where a lot of the species, which is what is happening now, die, then our lives are going to be much more difficult to live, because we won't have the sustenance from natural processes that we depend on. But we're also going to live in a much more arid and ugly world. So that protecting that sort of the sustenance of what makes your autonomy possible is something that must be highlighted, because the reason why we don't see it, first of all, is because we associate our independence with this fast pace. I'm answering my email and I'm talking to you, and by the way, I would never do that, but people do that a lot. And the other is that these other cycles are much slower. And but what is important about them is that they make our super fast-paced temporality.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Is the slow things actually give create the opportunity for fast things to exist, even. Even I would even take it back, the slow unfolding of time, allowing for our universe, our Milky Way galaxy, our Earth, us, and then all the way down to us creating the internet and these other faster paced things. So I really think that brings a point actually to that I've learned about time or through time, is that everything in this universe is literally interconnected. It's not like some spiritual, like, oh, we're all connected together, but literally through physics, through energy, through time, even, I guess, even quantum mechanics, like in terms of possibilities, everything is interconnected. And even that is true now of like social realities with biological realities. And we saw that with COVID, you know, like something that is imperceptible to the eye, a virus coming from a bat in China. Now the whole world is aware of this and influenced by it. And so, I think we're moving further or accelerating in that direction, actually, of like interconnectedness. So I think that's why, for me, human rights is a really important issue, because it's an issue for all humans that it's not just like in Russia or America or Belarus or wherever. It's got to be for everybody at this point, because we're all humans, and we're all connected on this planet very almost directly these days.
And that's what is so interesting about human rights. So I want to say two things about that. This is a very important point that you just made. When the current international human rights framework was created back after Second World War, the Nuremberg trials, they already were. There are these major conventions: the the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights. And what is interesting is I don't want to get too much into what's in these treatises, other than saying that they are obligations. They're the most ratified treatises in the planet, and they protect human dignity as such. And one thing that was emphasized after the Nuremberg trials is that whenever there is genocide, or wherever there is a gross violation of human dignity, you're no longer looking at the Germans doing something at the Jews, or some people, some group doing something to some other group. What you're seeing is a violation of human dignity, an interconnected notion of dignity that protects all of us and that we should all care about. So this notion of interconnectedness is really important. As you said, in quantum mechanics, it's very important to even understand quantum mechanics. But in for the notion of dignity, it's super important, because the idea is human rights are not divisible, right? So you can't just protect property and just care about property. You also need to care about education and basic
intangible things.
Yeah, you need to protect people from getting arbitrarily detained or tortured. So human rights are a unity. They're indivisible. They must irradiate other laws for them to be effective. And so there is not only interconnectivity, and that's what I worked on when I worked on human rights, is this thesis that I think was used in Spanish tribunals, but there was a constitutional amendment based on this in Mexico. It's called the irradiation of human rights. It's not only that they're interconnected, but that they should permeate other laws. And that's what I was trying to say when I said, there's nothing wrong. Well, there's a lot of things wrong with the internet, but there's nothing wrong with the effort to communicate through the internet. And there's nothing in principle wrong with having property. There's nothing wrong with having banks and so on. But we need to reevaluate how we are structuring our society in terms of these much lower systems. And you mentioned the prison system. We need to reevaluate how we have this cycle of retribution that punishes people who are already oppressed, right? So when you have overlapping systems that are reproducing a cycle of more and more wealth for few people, and then less and less possibilities, and less interconnectedness for most people. And by the way, I think we're losing interconnectedness paradoxically by having all these systems of technology. But the prison system is just one part that is particularly is particularly outrageous, because most people that end up in prison have already been punished their entire lives by belonging to certain groups that have no means of succeeding on other things. So I think we need probably two things. One of them is to slow down. One of them is to slow down and think and reflect on how to reevaluate these systems that we're using. And another one is, I know that you're very interested in the prison system. Another one is to prevent, not only re-examining the prison system, but make it less morally irresponsible, right? Because what happens is people that have suffered, including people with mental disabilities, end up in a system that just escalates the level of suffering. So there's nothing, and of course the legal justification is that punishment is what you deserve. But of course that needs reevaluation too, because what we want is to help prisoners, not to make their lives even more miserable.
Yeah, I mean, especially with that system, there's I think a lot of incorrect underlying assumptions. I don't think most people in the prison system, especially those with power, have any idea of what a human is. And I think they make the mistake of thinking, oh, well, I'm a human. I've talked with humans my whole life. I surely know what a human is. But that's just their own personal brand of psychology, which is probably and definitely not true. And I think a lot of people, it's easy to be like, oh, well, you've been alive for 50 years or whatever, but you know nothing about time, you know? So that's kind of what I see there. But one of the, like, going back to these underlying assumptions, the prison system, I think the system itself has values, right? It has values and beliefs, like a group of people would with their collective consciousness or their culture, or just any individual. So what I see with all of our systems, including the country itself, is that our underlying assumptions about time and space are incorrect. Then thus the underlying assumptions about humans are incorrect. And I think that stems back from our history. No one's at fault. I mean, I think it's literally like 1678 was when Newton came out with his Principia Mathematica, and his underlying assumptions about time and space, which were found to be incorrect. But 1678, that's 98 years before 1776. And all of the founders of our forefathers in America, they were heavily influenced by Isaac Newton. And only in like 1919 did Einstein come out with his theory of relativity and abolish all of those underlying assumptions. And what I see now is we have not updated. We have not taken relativity and what Einstein gave us, and really it has not radiated or irradiated. It really is only using like GPS, like tracking and satellite stuff. But other than that, I don't see relativity made use of in governance, in prison. And I think that really hurts our systems, because if our systems value time in a linear and static way, and it really does show in prison, the prison system, but it's going to influence the entirety of that human's experience in that system. And it's not just for prisoners, it's for the guards as well.
Yeah.
And actually, you can, if you look through like the assessments that they have for some of these prison systems in California, at least, you can see that the underlying assumption is so incorrect about what this human is and like how this human is going to move through time. It's really, it's bad, I think.
Well, I mean, it is
but
interesting what you said, that it has its own values, and most people accept those values.
Yeah, and a lot of the values that we have as humans are influenced by those of the system, because the system is much larger. You can even think of the system as environment, you know, entirely influencing you. So I do want to ask you one, it's a pretty simple question here, but it's not an easy one probably, but kind of piggybacking off of that, what is, in your opinion, a human being?
That's really
and there are a lot of verifiable answers, I'm sure.
And
given
it's really a great question, because there are a lot of obvious answers that people can think of, right? So
I guess I'm looking for verifiable, something that is verifiable either through logic or science or
it's a really good question. So let me say one thing first, sort of indirectly, and then I'll tell you what I think. It's very difficult to, and first of all, it's an old philosophical question. It's a central question because it justifies our treatment towards animals, for example. In the, let's say in the Inquisition or during the colonies, people dehumanize other humans. So to them, they were more human, or they were above other humans. So it's a very politically very important question, philosophically important question. I liked what you said about thinking about relativity as in political contexts, like there is no unique frame of reference, right? There's always depends on the observer and the velocity, well, the frame.
How and when you measure and where and all of that. And
Donna Haraway, I mean, with respect to this issue about human and the place of humans in the cosmos, you can call it, she talks about these 4 dethronements of human anthropocentrism, right? The idea that we are the most important and unique thing in the planet, certainly above animals. And so she mentions the Copernican revolution, where we found out we're no longer at the center of the universe. Darwin, when we found out that we're one among many, many, many species, many of which are extinct and live for much more longer periods of time than humans. And we're a rather late addition and a pretty accidentally weird kind of addition. So it is dramatic, right? To think Darwin really changed the way we think of our place in the cosmos. Then she mentions Freud, because Freud showed that we're not so much in charge of our minds. A lot of unconscious activity determines our lives. And then the fourth, it could be thought of as the possibility that intelligent machines could emerge at some point. Then that would completely take us off the map of privilege, right? So what's a human being? What I want to say, I think this is a logical consequence of what I just told you. Depends, is contextual on values. According to human rights, human beings are creatures with intrinsic dignity, with intrinsic value. Their lives are intrinsically valuable.
Let me challenge you real quick. From a physics perspective, that's completely erroneous, though. That doesn't exist.
Value doesn't exist. So other than some epistemic value, mathematical value assignment, but that's not the notion of value we're talking about here. The notion of value we're talking about here is by the mere fact that you're a human being, Suresh, I should respect your dignity and your life.
Yeah.
I shouldn't treat you badly.
So I kind of
that has to be at least part of what a human being is. But again, what is a human being changes, right? With knowledge.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think that's a interesting point, because I tend not to see too much of a greater importance on a human being than other living things, other than like what we can do and cool. Like, I don't think we inherently have more value. Especially from like a physics perspective, we're all just atoms and blah, 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 subatomic particles. But how we relate to things, coming back to time here, I think if we see humans as this special species rather than as something that is entirely part of life, as a form of life even, it makes it hard to treat these other species well and with like proper dignity and respect, which I think as a living thing they tend to deserve too. Because no one's going to want to, it's maybe easy to like flick an ant off your table, but it's harder to just kill a dolphin, you know?
Yeah.
And so now you're coming into these like really contextual like differences where it's like, oh, I just happen to care here, or I happen to care there. And so like the way I kind of look at a human being is a spender of time.
Yeah.
But that's verifiable. That's verifiably true.
A consumer and spender of time. That's absolutely correct. And that has also changed dramatically, how we consume and spend our time. It goes back to the first part of our conversation, has changed dramatically our dignity and our way of looking at the world. And so there's one thing that I want to mention is that there is both a bright and a really dark aspect of circumscribing humans from the rest of the machinery of the world. In the Industrial Revolution, this was interpreted as humans are the only creatures with rational capacities, are the only creatures with dignity. So the entire natural world, which was sacred for most spiritual traditions, the entire natural world is machinery. Is just fodder for our machines. It's just exploitable. We actually, science is the investigation of how to exploit the machinery of life. And there's a kind of dark betrayal of human dignity because we are part of that nature. We're part of that interconnected machinery. So that's the really dark side, that it has turned us into consumers of time in very selfish schemes where we're exploiting nature, right? And so part of our consumption of time is consuming nature itself. The bright side is the dignity side, right? So circumscribing what the human condition is in terms of dignity helps justifying doing more for people that are suffering. And that's the brighter part of it. So there's a negative and a positive. Unfortunately, as we've been talking about throughout our conversation, I think it is the other one, the darker one, that has prevailed in markets and legal systems. And
100% agree. Up to this point, that's definitely true.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're kind of ending on our time here, but I've got one last question for you. I ask it of everybody that I have on here because the purpose of this podcast is to talk with people that have either power, wealth, or influence about how they value time, to kind of humanize that and hopefully radiate or irradiate like that conversation and thought and thinking to other people. So I want to ask you, and you don't have to, just a 2-3 minute thing answer but here, but how do you value time?
I think I've valued time more and more as I get older. I I value, for example, I try to, so before I really value my time in terms of competitiveness and positional goods, like I value my time sort of in terms of like, oh, I'm putting this much time into this.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a very kind of commercially driven, I mean, not commercially driven, but commercial-like kind of value. And I'm trying to move away from that.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm finding, I'm finding is in part through talking to people like you who are also interested in this, that the more I value time in this other way, which is not how much time I'm putting into this, but what I'm learning and how can I spend time just thinking or just getting away from that other kind of time ticking. What I'm finding, which is really interesting, is that by doing that, I'm learning more about how other people value their time and how much I should also value their time.
Yep.
So I think the more you get away from this ultra competitive way of valuing time, which is coined in the phrase "time is money,"
Yeah.
the more interconnected you become to the times of other people, of other cultures, which are slower in the way they deliver their cultural products and their knowledge, but also the time of natural phenomena in general. I think the ticking time of industrial clocks and of markets prevents us from valuing the interconnectedness of time.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of the time of other people and the dignity of the way they value their time, which I think I completely agree with you. There's a very deep connection there. So I hope that I can keep doing this, value time less and less in terms of the more commercial, although it's inescapable, right? If you have a job, you need to worry about it. But if we can manage to pay more attention to other people, for example, and less to our computers and our income, that would help us value time differently.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. If we can learn to value time better for our own selves, that makes it easier to value other people's time, to show them respect and dignity and compassion, empathy. And I even think relativity sits at that intersection, because it allows you to be like, oh, well, they are experiencing time too, but it's completely unique to them. It's their own subjective experience. And so having that respect. So yeah, I thought that was a great answer. And I really thank you for your time today. It was fun just going back and forth and talking about time and the mind, consciousness, all of that. So yeah, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll be speaking soon. I've got something to send to you. I'll send that soon. But yeah, I just want to thank you again. Have a great rest of your weekend.
It's always a pleasure, and I hope we stay in touch and keep
valuing
time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.